just in case anybody needs to watch it another time. Okay, right. Just let you know what this kind of little seminar is about. So I was a mentor using Steplab in the first kind of round of when Steplab was starting to be used for initial teacher training, and I was lucky enough to be able to be kind of there at the beginning when it all started, and listening to mentors and so on. And the purpose of this afternoon, I would like to make it as brief as we possibly can, because obviously we're all very busy. That the purpose of this afternoon is really to share my workflow with you. That's really the purpose of this seminar. So in terms of using Steplab itself, obviously I will be going through some of the kind of broad points of using Steplab. But kind of the main point of today was really to share my kind of retrospective view of how I used it and how I made it as easy to use as possible. So I've called it a mentor's take, because it's kind of how I managed to navigate my way through using Steplab as painlessly as possible, and obviously to try to maximize my impact with my tutee. I didn't use Steplab last year, but I used it the year before. So there might have been some tweaks in the meantime, but this is how I did my mentoring with my mentee when I used Steplab. I'll say from the off that I'm sure there's some people that are in this meeting who haven't really got up and running with Steplab yet. And I mean, sorry, there's still people coming into the meeting. Steplab up and running yet. But my advice would be kind of poke around, do try things out. You can't really break it. It's fine. Just click around things and see if you can navigate it. One of the common kind of complaints from mentors that I tended to get, because I ran quite a few of these little help sessions, like a surgery, with mentees about how they could best use it. And one of the biggest kind of issues, I think, was people found it very restrictive. And so what I'm going to try to do this afternoon is to address that and just say how I made it less restrictive, how I had a few workarounds which kind of helped me to kind of stay sane with it all. Okay, so sorry, laptop's running out of power. Okay, so if we'll just get straight on, if like I said, this session, just to reiterate, because a few people have joined since, just to reiterate, this is a session from a mentor who has used Steplab in the past and who wants to share his workflow with you, so that you can see kind of how it can possibly be done. It might not work in your context, but how I made it work when I was taking my mentee through their first year of ECT. So if that doesn't sound like it's something for you, then that is fine, just to leave if you want to. If you have got any questions while I'm talking, if there's something that you think, oh, I will need to ask about that, please put your hand up, do the raise hand thing in Teams, and then I will obviously speak to you, and you can turn your mic on. But if you can keep your mics off for the moment. Okay, so let's just go through some basics first of all. So the weekly observe feedback mentor cycle. This is something that I try. All right, can you hear me now? Is that okay? Somebody just say yes or something in the chat. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Izzy. Okay. So yes, so one of the most important things was, yes, thanks guys. One of the most important things was to get this cycle running that I could actually sustain. Now, one of the things that is said in the Steplab kind of training bits is that you should spend 20 minutes in a lesson. And I found that very challenging, I'll be honest. I found it very challenging on kind of two fronts, really. One, which 20 minutes do I choose to catch my trainee teacher teaching the bit I want to observe? That was a tricky bit. And also to spend 20 minutes and to get a quality bit of feedback that I could use going on to the next session. So my observe feedback mentor cycle I had to pin it down quite a lot. And what I decided with my mentee was we chose classes that we felt that he could demonstrate the things that were being asked of him. So For example, we chose a year 10 group that were a little bit bubbly, and so therefore they were useful for moving towards the behaviour targets. And another group that he taught, a year 8 group that he taught, was useful for kind of moving towards the kind of questioning or the exposition targets, those kinds of things. Okay, so we chose the groups where obviously our timetables matched up. But I have heard of mentors having really hardly any choice at all at which classes they can go and see. So you click on, hopefully you can see on the screen here, you observe and you click on the observe and feedback. And so what I tried to do was I took a laptop along to my observation. Initially I didn't. Initially I went in there with a pad and paper because I'm a bit old school like that. So I've been teaching a long time, and I'm used to writing down things. So very quickly I realized that taking the laptop into the lesson and logging on Steplab, bringing it up there and then, and actually doing it on Steplab as I was in the lesson really helped in terms of time management. So that's the first thing. If you are going in and writing copious notes and then you're coming out and having to translate it all in Steplab, I would really advise against that. If you could possibly take a laptop or a Surface or something into the lesson and do it while you're in there, it's a lot more time efficient. So so we go into the observation, and you click on observe and select. And during the observation, while you're sitting there, you've got your set of targets. You can see them on the right-hand side of the screen there. And one of the things that I was a bit confused about to start with is that I was under the impression that from whatever training I've been given, that all of these little toggles had to be toggled in order for the trainee to have achieved the step. Now, of course, you know, you hopefully they would be achieving most of those steps, but there were some of them that, you know, I really couldn't justify that my mentee, his name's Ewan, so I'm going to call him Ewan. I couldn't justify that he had actually met those things. So sometimes I would like, for example, this one here has got 6 little toggles on it, and I would toggle maybe 5 or 4 and then say that he had achieved the step because he'd done most of them. When we got later down the line, when it got into sort of January, February, there were things that I did toggle as he'd met them because I remember seeing them in a previous lesson. I gave myself quite a lot of latitude in terms of being reasonable and you know, sensible and practical about meeting these criteria. So then you'd click on those little tags, and then you click on, have they achieved the step, yes or not yet. I think there was only one instance where I clicked on not yet, where I felt that he hadn't done enough of those. So, you know, that usually ends up with them going back and doing something similar again, perhaps with a different group. When you choose your key question, I would always edit it. So it would always make a kind of suggestion about what to say as my key question, but I would always make sure that it was my own question. And I try to, the question that I've got here up on the screen is really focused on the student's learning. So I think one thing that I made sure I worked into my question, not to make it too generic, because it, you know, obviously it didn't work for every single lesson, but what I tried to do is to kind of emphatically impress on the ECT that he had to really focus on the student's learning and you know, to come away and talk in a mentor session about their learning and what evidence he had for it taking the learning forward and the students making progress, I think was really important. So I tried to make the key question as impactful as I possibly can, that obviously encapsulates the focus, like I've said on the text, or moves the conversation on to something that the student can be aiming for. So that was quite important, that key question, because you kind of got one of those every mentor session, which we did weekly. Like I said, if anybody's got any questions, please raise your hand and ask. I do realise I'm talking at all of you, and if anybody's not following or they have a question, please let me know. So there's a box to record praise, and of course I really recommend that you try to do this every single time. You know, we all thrive off praise, I'm sure, and I think there's a little tag on there nowadays to do a shout out, which means that other mentees can see what they've done particularly well. I tended to choose the thing that we were focusing on, but I would also add other things that made him a good teacher that I felt was relevant. But I think that's an important one. Record the praise. Now, the deciding on the next step. This was the bit that lots of mentors said to me, "What's really restrictive? I've only got a certain number of things to choose from." Kind of, you know, like walking into a restaurant and it's saying chips on the menu and that's all you've got. Obviously, it wasn't as restrictive as that, but what I would do while I was in the lesson is I'd have some idea of where we were going next with our target setting. Like I said, if I'm not making sense, please raise your hand and ask me a question. I would think about where we were going as far as our target setting was concerned, and then I would, while I was sitting in the lesson, I would go and look at the next steps. So we were on, for example, the module B7, positive learning environment. So I would click on these and go back and zoom in and have a look at lots of different targets and find the one that I thought was most appropriate and something that I thought that Ewan could work towards. So like I said, while I was actually in the lesson, listening to the teaching unfolding and watching what he'd just done, I would then be sitting there kind of working my way through all the different targets that came up under all these things: embracing error, positive role modeling, acknowledgement or praise. Those things, I'd be looking at each individual target under those subheadings and then decide which one I was doing. So once you've done that, then it obviously zooms in and it brings down a bunch of targets. So you focus on an appropriate type for that particular subheading. So for this one, I think I chose the bottom one, which was teacher ensures pupils are focused on the thought process behind the answer, because I felt that that was something that he wasn't considering at that time in his development. And then I decided that would be the target. Now, this is the bit that I missed out for the first few weeks because I didn't get my head around how things were working. But what I would then do, once I'd focused on a target, I would then, obviously that comes up with those steps. So these are the appropriate steps for that target. I just thought I'd put those up on the screen so you can see those are the steps and you select the appropriate step. So I would choose this specific one. So it would narrow down and narrow down and narrow down until you made a complete target. This is what I was saying about lots of mentors feeling this was very restrictive and felt they wanted to give their mentees something that was broader. But I think this is just the way the software works. You kind of focus down into one thing and then move it forward. So once I focused on that, I would then it would come up in as his next step. And then what I would do is I would then write my evaluation of the lesson, the notes I would make in the evaluation of the lesson, linked to this target. So I was kind of looking at the endpoint and thinking, how can I link my observation that I've made during this lesson with that target I'd chosen? So I hope that makes sense. I'll explain that again because I'm not sure how clear it was for you. So I went through all the targets, I narrowed it down to the focus and picked the single step that I wanted Ewan to do, that I felt that would be the next appropriate thing, looking at the kind of the evidence and looking at what was happening in his lesson. And then I would go back and then I'd scroll back up through the lesson observation form that you get in Steplab. And then I would write some things down that said, you need to work on this, which matched with the next target. I know that sounds like it's doing it backwards, but it helps me really link up from one thing to the next rather than writing some things, evidence in the lesson, and then going on to something which wasn't linked. Yes, Kathy, do you want to put your mic on?
Yeah, did you do all this whilst you're observing in that 20-minute slot?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I tried to do it with the laptop in front of me. So you did say 20 minutes here, and something I failed to mention is that 20 minutes was not adequate for doing this job. I would say safely, I was anywhere between 30 and 40 minutes in a lesson. So it would take me that long to obviously collect the evidence I'd needed, making sure I was in the lesson at the right time to observe the thing that I was supposed to be observing. This is what's, you know, arguably I think it is restrictive in that sense, because if you're looking to specifically see how a teacher talks to a class and, for example, does countdowns and gets the class all paying attention, and you kind of walk into the lesson 5 minutes after they've done that really well, it's really difficult. So that's why I found myself, rather than kind of popping in for 20 minutes, seeing what I needed to see and leaving, that was a kind of rare occurrence. I would actually go in and spend 30, 40 minutes making sure that I'd done the most that I could on Steplab before the mentor session. I hope that makes sense. I couldn't cut down on the amount of time it took to do this stuff in the lesson. But yes, I did do it in the lesson, to answer your question. Does that make sense, Kathy?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So the next step really was, once I'd chosen that target and I'd written about how the teacher needs to move forward with that target and what evidence there was in the lesson I'd just seen that supported that target. No, sorry, Lucy. This session is for mentors, really. It's for mentors and how to, a suggestion of how to use Steplab. So it's, just from one mentor to other mentors, how you can possibly use Steplab. Hope that makes sense. Okay. So now the other thing that was that, of course, this particular process is the modelling. Now, I used to get my mentee to watch the videos, read the case studies and so on Steplab. And of course, a lot of the modelling, when we see the modelling, we see a teacher standing at a whiteboard, talking to a non-existent class and saying, and talking through the kind of script that you would talk through as a teacher. And again, I heard lots of mentors say to me, sometimes that kind of modelling isn't appropriate, or my mentee needs to model like that, and other times my mentee is past that point, and so they don't need to model that. So this is really just to kind of maybe give you some confidence in what you're doing. But what I read modelling as, and it worked really well for me and Ewan, and that was, we modelled other things. It didn't necessarily mean standing in front of a whiteboard pretending the class are there. It also, because it mentions scripts on this very slide that I've got in front of you. But so I used modelling for things like, because I'm a science teacher, so therefore we were doing science stuff. So one particular week he was coming up to an end of module test, and so therefore I modelled for him how to, for example, mark questions, feedback to students. I also modelled how to write a starter quiz, modelled how to assess, basically.
What is Steplab?
Hello, Will.
Exciting.
Will, can you hear me?
Okay, so I'm going to go through these.
Oh, good. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. So yeah, so I would use the modelling for lots of different things that I want to do with my mentee, not just standing in front of a whiteboard pretending a class were there, getting them to line up, or whatever else the modelling might be. And also I would ask him to ask me questions, and then I would critique what he'd asked me, and we'd clarify questioning. So I think you should have the courage, I suppose, is the easy way to say it, the courage to be able to model how you see fit, that you think your mentee actually needs. So if you think they need to be modeled of how to plan or something like that, because some students come in not knowing how to plan, or don't understand how to plan, sequencing, all that kind of stuff, and of course you can model it for them, and then they can model it back to you. So that was something that I thought I mentioned, because I very much got the feeling that that I had to get them up in front of the whiteboard and pretend there was a class there. Okay, so if anybody's got any questions, obviously please let me know. But I used modelling, I think, a lot more loosely, and I think it works quite well. So you can see that this is the sort of thing you get on Steplab, where modelling is in an empty classroom. And that was a bit awkward sometimes with the trainee teacher. They didn't, particularly like standing up front and talking to nobody. So at the beginning, it worked really well because they needed to practice that, and they needed a script, and they needed to think things through. But I think as time went on, when they were clearly showing me that in the classroom, then I didn't feel as though they needed to model those kinds of things, and other things came into modeling. I hope that kind of makes sense. Okay, so gather evidence to identify Ewan's next step. So this, can you see there's a little box at the top? This is more what I was talking about earlier. So I was linking the next step with the evidence that I was looking for in the lesson. So just to make sure everything was tied up, I'd go to the final steps, drill down into the individual step that I wanted him to pursue, and then I'd go back and I would type in this box in the top that kind of supported going on to that next step, and that kind of tied everything together and kept everything ticking over nicely. Hope that kind of makes sense. So rather than kind of guessing what the steps are going to be, drill down into the steps while you're in the lesson, have a look around, see which one you think is most appropriate for your mentee on that particular module that they're doing, B6, B7, or whatever else it might be, and then type in some evidence to support that next step. Hope that makes sense. That worked for me, and I got into the swing of doing that, and it cut down on a lot of time. And then, of course, once you've done that, it's over to giving feedback. And down in the bottom left there, you can see it says give feedback. So one of the things that frustrated me a little bit as a mentor is once the mentee had done their lesson and done their observation, I felt there was no way of me sharing that with them immediately unless I met with them after school on the day that they'd done the lesson, and that wasn't always convenient for either of us. So what I tended to do was I tended to take like the previous screen. I'll just click back to the previous screen. Yeah, so for example, the gather evidence to identify a human's next step. What I would do on my laptop is I would take a screenshot. I would use Snipper or something, snipping tool to highlight that, and then to paste it into an email to him. So he would have some of the stuff that was actually going to appear in our mentor session in advance. And it just so turned out the way that our calendar worked was that I would often go and observe him on a Thursday or Friday, usually a Friday. And that meant he kind of had the whole weekend without knowing how he'd done, of course, unless I spoke to him in person. So what I would do is I'd say a few things to him after the lesson, but then I would send him screenshots and screen snips of what I'd actually typed in for him, so that he could think about it, he could digest it in the time before our mentor session. And I think that really helped, because it made the feedback a lot quicker in a mentor session, because he'd already considered it and he'd already had his questions about it, and I could answer them. Okay, so rather than giving the feedback to the mentor session, I would send him copies of what I'd said, and then he could, dispute it if he thought I got something wrong, or he could think about it and consider it for the mentor session. And then the feedback only took 10 minutes of the mentor session, and the rest of the mentor session was on the modelling and talking about the next target. Yeah, so here's an example of something that we did in a mentor session, and like I said, because I'd given him a screenshot of this, he knew what was coming up on our mentor session on the Monday. And so you can see down the bottom, I've said, design a short activity for me to do, commensurate with my ability to complete that activity. So, assume I'm a very high ability student, assume I'm a very high ability student with your particular specialism, biology, as it turned out, and then we basically you could question me and dig deeper, because it was all about targeting questions, making sure the thought process comes before the question, And so he made up some questions for me, and we talked about those questions, dug deeper, and then we were able to model by formulating a short script or process for doing the same in an upcoming lesson with the students. So there's just an example of the kind of modeling we did, which wasn't standing at the board pretending a class is there. It was more about, right, you're going to practice doing this with me, and then we're going to talk about, you know, how the questions come across to me as a student, and then together we put our heads together and thought, right, how are we going to put a script together for you to help you to do it actually in your class next week. And of course, then I could go back and watch him do that, and clearly, you know, tick off that he'd done those particular targets, and he could be successful at it. So, and that kind of process worked pretty well for me. I've got the last slide is my kind of workflow about what I did. So kind of round in a loop. So this was on a weekly basis. So I would see him on a Monday and kind of observe him on a Thursday and Friday, depending on what the lesson was that we wanted to look at. So we decide we decide an area of focus, discuss that, model and practice that. So like I said, modeling could kind of take any form where I was helping to show Ewan what the kind of best practice was. Then when we decided how, you know, which is the best class to come and see, obviously timetable constraints, but we'd usually have a choice of maybe 2 lessons to go to. And, you know, so aiming for that high success rate. So yeah, I think I can do that with 8B2. Let's go and see 8B2 with the questioning, and let's see how that goes. Then I would go into the lesson with my laptop. Like I said, very important to fill it in as you observe. I put that in italics. And, you know, that includes obviously 1 or 2 well-chosen questions, well-formulated questions to ask during feedback, and next steps while completing the gathering evidence to identify sections. So it ensures that it's all linked together and it all flows nicely, one thing into the next. And then after, you know, screenshotting, copy and pasting his feedback to my ECT in advance, so he could consider what I'd said and he could consider his next steps, particularly in the light of the fact that, I mean, the way we worked was that I'd observe him on Thursday and Friday. He had decided that he wanted to do his planning and preparation on a Saturday morning. And so he'd watch his ECT Steplab videos and things, and he would consider what we talked about in the feedback on a Saturday morning. And then on the Monday, I'd meet him and we'd have our ECT session. So he was prepared for that. He'd done his modules on Steplab. He'd watched those and answered the questions. And he'd also considered what I talked about in the lesson. And that worked quite nicely. And it just got us into a routine and we didn't have to think too much about how we did it. And then obviously round to the top again and repeat. So you can see clearly by that, we are, you know, we're looking at 2 hours, at least kind of 2 hours, as well as the time that the mentor takes to go onto Steplab and check that their mentee is doing their study, you know, working through the units and so on. Yeah, so if anybody's got any questions about anything that that I've raised, then let me know. So Terry Lee.
This may not be a question you can answer directly, but all in all, this is taking about 2 hours. So would you drop in every single week for this, or does that depend on the school?
Yeah, I would say it definitely depends on the school. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think I just got fortunate the fact that our timetables work together. I mean, some people might have completely clashing timetables and just simply can't do it. Our timetables work together. We both could meet on a Monday after school because we could. Just that was what, you know, there wasn't any meetings on a Monday in that particular year. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I really believe that if you're going to do a quality job of this, you need this time to be able to spend with your mentee and work through these things. So it just yeah, it depends. It's going to change from school to school where that time is available, yeah. And of course it depends on your leadership team, how much time they give you to do this job. Often this is a bolt-on, and it just kind of adds on rather and is invisible work rather than actually being assigned time. But whereas in other schools they will assign you the time. So yeah, okay. So I can't answer that question other than, you know, I got lucky.
And you personally dropped in every week and had a meeting every week?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, lovely, thank you.
Okay. Yes, Kathy.
I'm just wondering if on Steplab you can go back and see what you've written, so that when you're doing those reviews, the written reviews, you can sort of evidence it against the teacher's standards.
Yeah, I didn't do that, if I'm honest. I tended to kind of tick things off and then move on. So I'm sure that if you went back through, because they colour them in blue when they're completed, and one of the things that I kind of fell foul of at the start was, well, I didn't click on everything. I didn't make sure everything was completed. And there was a couple of units that it said we hadn't completed, and we actually had. It's just because I hadn't clicked on things. But I don't see why you can't go back and have a look at stuff you've done previously. But like I said, there's enough there for me to do a target, move on, do a target, move on, and continue without having to kind of loop back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else got anything they want to raise? Like I said, this is just something that worked for me, and in your context, it might not work for you. Yes, Daniel.
30 to 40 minutes. I've got to go in there.
Daniel, are you there?
We're going to need to cover the class. Someone's going to need to come in here.
Daniel, yes. Daniel, can you hear me? I can see you've got your hand up, Daniel, but you're not responding. Maybe you need to type something in the chat. Daniel, can you hear me? You've got your oh no, your hand's gone down. Okay. Anybody else like to mention anything about Steplab? Because one of the things that I mentioned to Danielle, who I work for at this end in Bournemouth, is that because it's we haven't even finished September yet, some people might have not really got up and running with this, and sometimes it takes maybe a few goes at this to really understand what's going on with it. And I did suggest to her that maybe we do another little surgery, maybe in a month's time, and maybe we can pick apart what people are doing. I don't want them to be up for that. But yeah, if you're feeling it's restrictive, then you're not alone. And if you're feeling that it takes a lot of time and it's time intensive, and like I've kind of outlined in this particular this slide, then again, you're not alone. But I think that if you are going to do a quality job and you are going to give your mentee, due process, shall we say, it does take a little bit of while to do, particularly with the mental sessions. I would spend probably between 40 minutes and an hour doing modelling and talking through things with my mentee. Okay, so if anybody's everybody's happy with that and they haven't got any more questions, like I said, my advice would be just to poke around and give it a go. You can't really break it. And if you want to email me directly or get in touch via Teams or whatever, then I'm more than happy to have a one-to-one with you and talk you through things. But I have talked to some very, very frustrated people over the last 2 years. Yeah, if you do get frustrated by it, you are not alone. But just kind of reach out and we'll do our best to run these sessions to help you to do it better. All right. So if you're happy and you've got something from this session, then feel free to leave, because obviously we're all busy. But please do reach out and get in touch if you do need any extra sessions or any direct help. Then I'm happy to do that. All right. Thank you, everyone, and best of luck. No problem. Thank you very much for coming.